The pivot screw tension game. Anybody who's had folding knives for a while knows exactly what I'm about to talk about. Hello everybody, Mannix here. Got a little knife video for you right here, right now, but first feel free to subscribe, hit that little bell notification if you do not want to miss weekly knife and gun videos. So when it comes to the pivot screw tension on a knife, assuming you have a folding knife that has an adjustable pivot, like most of them in 2024 do, there comes a balance between having a strong enough side-to-side or horizontal lockup and a loose enough lockup to the point that the knife can be deployed quickly and easily without requiring too much or any wrist movement. Now, this was more of an issue with older knives, especially older knives going back a little over a decade ago or so. These days, most knives don't have this issue, but this guy's from over a decade ago, the Boker S2. It's still one of my favorites, but it's kind of behind most of the technology in the folding knives we have today. I still love it, but objectively, there could be improvements made to its overall design, being a flipper. It does not have any ball bearings. A lot of knives coming out these days are on ball bearing tracks. You can flick those suckers out so quickly with no wrist movement whatsoever most of the time and crank down the pivot screw as tight as it could almost get and have a very, very strong side-to-side lockup while being able to deploy the knife so quickly and effortlessly. But again, going back to most older knives like this guy, it was usually a game of going back and forth, getting it tight enough to get that nice, strong horizontal lockup, but not too tight that you can't flick it out anymore. Right now I have this knife at kind of a middle ground. It flicks out okay, but if I try to deploy it without any wrist movement, I don't usually get it there. Almost right there. Can't do it. I need just a little bit of something. Just need to move my wrist just a little bit, and it opens up every single time. But I do need that little bit of conscious wrist movement right there. The lockup, on the other hand, is pretty good, but I can feel it moving just a little bit. Just a little bit. There's just a little bit of movement in there. Probably slipping a piece of paper in there or something. It's not going to make a difference when it comes to any actual use with the folding knife. It's not going to hurt anything, I don't think. It's not that loose or anything. It doesn't have to lock up like a bank vault. But objectively, it's not what I would call an extremely tight lockup. There is some movement in there. So let's say, all right, well, I'm going to tighten it down just a little bit. All right, so it should be tighter now. Oh, I can't even flick it open now, though. All right, well, at least let's just check the lockup. Oh, tight. I don't feel nearly as much. Very, very tight lockup. It's great, but I can't deploy this anymore without doing something goofy like that or using both of my hands. I want to be able to open this knife with one hand, but I also want a strong lockup. So let me just loosen this, micro crank that backwards just a little bit. Is this any better? Okay, I could flick it open. Still needs a little bit of a wrist movement though. Is the lockup any better? Maybe a little bit. Here, let's just tighten it just a little bit more. Bink, just a little bit. Just micro crank that one more time. See where we're at now. Again, I kind of failed right there, but I just flick my wrist a little bit. It works. But again, it's a little bit tighter now. It's a little bit harder. I need a little bit more wrist movement, but it's a little bit tighter. Okay. Can I find a middle ground right there? You know, let me just loosen it back just a little bit. Let me go backwards, just like basically nothing, but feels a little better, but there's some play. Let's just, for craps and giggles, we're going to loosen this guy a little bit more. This is a little bit more loose for my uses, but ooh, flicks out almost effortlessly. Yeah, no wrist movement needed this time, as you can see. Basically no wrist movement needed, almost no wrist movement. It's wobbling considerably now. Will that matter with everyday use, even tactical use? Maybe, maybe not. But you know what? I just want it to be just a little bit tighter right there because I'm not really comfortable with that. Just going to kind of leave it back where it was. Right about here. Needs a little bit of wrist movement, and we have like a pretty good lockup. I would give that like a B+, maybe. This knife in particular it's an older guy that they never updated, and most knives, again, going back over 10 years ago or so, in the early 2010s, and before that, this was a huge thing. You had to find that sweet spot of the pivot tension. You wanted it to be tight enough that it wasn't wobbling around too much in the open position, but you didn't want it too tight that it was difficult to open. And you didn't want it so loose that although it would be very easy to deploy, it would have a very loose lockup. So you had to find that middle ground. Do you prefer having your knives deploy quickly and effortlessly, even if it means having a slightly loose lockup? Or Do you prefer having a very bank vault tight lockup, even if it means you gotta use some wrist movement or have to open the knife conventionally, if you're a hardcore lockup dude? Please let me know in the comments down below. It's always interesting to hear what everybody's preferences are. I'm kind of a middle ground. I don't want that blade wobbling around too much either. I want it to be tight enough and deploy quick enough, even if it's just kind of okay at both. And then a whole nother part of the game is the blade centering. This usually never bothered me, but depending on what orientation or how tight you have that pivot tension down, this blade is going to be moving left or right. This is not perfectly centered. It's almost perfectly centered. I call it centered enough, but you can see it's slightly pointing to the right there. Blade centering doesn't bother me as long as it's not physically rubbing against either side of the handle. There you go, a little blast from the past for you right there, the pivot screw tension game. It still applies in 2024, and I'm assuming will for a few years beyond, but these days it's less of a big deal because the ball bearing tracks we have so many of our knives on, again, you can crank those suckers down really tight and still have really fast deployments because the ball bearing's a whole nother beast. But when it comes to everything else, the pivot screw tension game usually applies. Thank you so much for watching. Mannix out.